Hi. One of the odder truisms that one often encounters in policy circles is the idea that conflicts have no military solution. So, for example, on 12 November 2024, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, asserted before the UN Security Council the following regarding Sudan's civil war. She said, "There is, quite simply, no military solution to this crisis. None. All countries should cease providing military support to the belligerents, and every one of us must continue to press the parties to return to the negotiating table with the aim of ending this conflict." Now, taken at face value, the statement is not remarkable, except that this is far from being the only time that a senior U.S. diplomat or any other senior diplomat has made this kind of assertion about seemingly intractable conflicts. A simple Google search, for example, with the term State Department and, quote, "no military solution," unquote, turns up all sorts of nuggets, such as in 3 August 2021, the U.S. Special Representative to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, who should be the subject of another video, although I'm not sure I'll be very nice, said that there was no military solution to the Afghanistan war. That was 2021. He was echoing a State Department spokesman's statement in 2011 that there was, quote, "no military solution," unquote, to the Afghanistan war. On 12 September 2022, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken opined that there was, quote, "no military solution," unquote, to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Similarly, on 9 November 2022, another State Department spokesman said that there was, quote, "no military solution to the war in Libya." On 3 December 2014, a Washington Post columnist took the Obama administration to task for saying that no less than 3 conflicts, the ones in Iraq, Syria, and Ukraine, had, quote, "no military solution," unquote. On 1 January 2006, Richard Boucher, Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, affirmed that there was no military solution to the conflict in Sri Lanka. Honestly, I could go on, especially if we expand our scope to include foreign governments and senior UN officials. For example, on 21 June 2024, UN Secretary of General Antonio Guterres asserted at a press conference that there was, quote, "no military solution," unquote, to the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This is all complete nonsense. In this video, I want to talk about why. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. There almost always is a solution to a military conflict. It usually consists of one side winning. Take Sri Lanka, for example. Now, remember, in 2006, Boucher, however one pronounces his name, said that there was no military solution to the conflict there. Yet 3 years later, in 2009, the Sri Lankan government, which clearly disagreed with the man, won the war. They crushed the last remaining pockets of the Tamil Tigers, while, by the way, ignoring calls by the international community not to do so for fear of possible civilian casualties. The war ended. No more Tamil Tigers. This man here, whose name I can never pronounce, and so I'm not even going to try, was the founder and leader of the Tamil Tigers. Sri Lankan government forces killed him and his family in the last days or hours of the Tamil Tigers' last stand. And as it turns out, taking him out did a lot of good for peace in Sri Lanka. The conflict was over. And then, of course, there was a war in Afghanistan. Remember, at least 2 senior U.S. diplomats said that there was no military solution to the war in Afghanistan. The Taliban, however, disagreed, and surprise, surprise, they defeated the Afghan military in 2021 and destroyed the Afghan government. So it turns out there was a military solution after all. Often what U.S. government officials really mean when they say that there's no military solution is that the United States or other international actors simply do not care enough about the conflict to take the measures that might end the war, or perhaps by somehow helping one of the 2 sides to win. Yes, the U.S. government did help the government of Afghanistan, which it created, etc., and it did fight a war there, but it conducted a limited war that reflected the fact that the U.S. had no vital interest at stake. So it really wasn't doing much interested in making a greater effort, something that might have created a military solution on the side of the Afghan government. Now, in some cases, and I think Sudan fits this category, the disinterest is matched by ambivalence regarding which side we actually want to win. So in Sudan Civil War, for example, there's a general agreement that both sides of the civil war are bad. And the debate is usually around which side is worse. By the way, most people seem to agree that the rapid support forces, the rebels, are worse than the government. But it's far from being black and white, and there are reasonable people who argue the opposite. But there's something going on here, and I think it's important to consider. I think it has to do with how nuclear weapons have reframed the way many people think about conflict. So let's back up. Our old friend Karl von Clausewitz made very clear that the purpose of war is victory, which one is to achieve by defeating the enemy's armed forces, ideally through a decisive battle, or at least their ability to fight, even if you don't actually destroy them all. This enables one to impose one's will. And even if this does mean that at some point one does move from the battlefield to the negotiating table, the idea is to be able to dictate your terms to the other side by, in effect, having destroyed their ability to resist. Usually for Clausewitz, victory came through a decisive military victory. Clausewitz allowed for the possibility of a limited war with limited objectives, but in that case as well, the idea was to win, which he identified as basically bringing the war to a conclusion that advanced one's interests at the expense of that of the other side. In the 20th century, Ferdinand Foch, the Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who arguably was the man who won World War I, he believed basically the same thing, and this was sort of essential to his 1903 classic, The Principles of War. Now, Foch's emphasis on winning through decisive battle basically held up until nuclear weapons came. Nuclear weapons had a profound effect on military strategy because they rendered virtually impossible any major war between nuclear-armed powers. Thus, the United States and the Soviet Union could not fight each other directly, and they could never seek anything like the kind of decisive victory that Clausewitz or Foch said was the primary objective of war. At most, the two superpowers could conduct acts of aggression, usually in areas of marginal importance to either side, acts that both understood to be below the threshold of unleashing a major war that could escalate to a total war, which nobody wanted. Why? Because total war could mean nuclear war. Now, in this context, victory no longer meant what it had in the past. Winning really meant avoiding war, and managing conflicts such that they did not lead to all-out war became a principal objective of statecraft. The point of military strategy was winning what French theorist Guy Brosselet referred to as the non-battle. From this point of view, the outbreak of war was tantamount to failure, not victory. During the Cold War, the communist side did what it could to promote its interests at the West's expense through marginal acts of aggression. Thus, it used proxies to fight in places like Indochina, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. And the West more or less went on the defensive, striving to limit conflict and preserve the status quo. But that was the main preoccupation, just preserving the status quo, which generally meant neither side should win a conflict. Western strategy became status quo focused. If a conflict did break out, the priority was putting a lid on the crisis, freezing it perhaps, and ideally restoring the status quo ante. Now, there's really good sense to this. This makes sense. But my argument is that perhaps we maybe have gone too far. First of all, not every conflict, especially not since the Cold War, carries the risk of an escalation that might lead to nuclear war. During the 1956 Suez Crisis and the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Soviets basically threatened nuclear war. And then first Eisenhower and Nixon responded by hitting the brakes on those two conflicts. In the case of the Yom Kippur War, that meant stopping the war before Israel might have achieved a decisive victory over the Egyptians, the kind of decisive victory that Clausewitz and Foch would have savored. But so it goes. The U.S. put its interests first, which is understandable, as it should, and the U.S. understood that its interests lay in ending the conflict between the two sides before the conflict reached its natural conclusion. The party was managing the crisis, not enabling a victory by one side or the other. Now, since the Cold War, however, none of the conflicts that have arisen, with the possible exception of the war in Ukraine, has carried any real risk of triggering World War III. No great powers cared enough about, let's say, the Sri Lankan conflict to intervene. Not even India, which generally had sympathies with the Tamil side. And in the early phases of the war, it helped the Tamil Tiger rebels, and this, at least until I believe the Tamil Tigers actually assassinated an Indian prime minister, which is kind of a party foul. Like, don't do that if you want these guys to be on your side. But so it goes. But even if India had intervened, there would not have been World War III, because no other major power had any interest in opposing it or imposing India. So India would have done what it would have done, and the rest of the world would have just looked on. So Sri Lanka crushed its enemy, and nothing happened. Israel could thrash Iran, or Hamas, or Hezbollah, which might lead potentially to a nasty regional war, although arguably there already is one. And perhaps, possibly, worst case scenario, thrashing Iran could devastate the global economy if the Iranians chose to shut down the Straits of Hormuz, which would have huge effects on, the price of oil and that kind of thing. But this wouldn't lead to a major war, and it certainly wouldn't lead to a war involving the great powers, and there would be no risk of major escalation or nuclear war. The same is true of Armenia and Azerbaijan. One of those two sides could have a decisive victory, which would probably be a tragedy for the people of one of those two countries, but it would not lead to the kind of major war, the kind of total wars involving great powers that nuclear weapons have made all but impossible. Likewise, one of the two parties to Sudan's civil war could crush the other, with zero risk of a major war. This might even be an optimal solution. I wonder about this, because maybe the kindest thing to do for the Sudanese people is to help one of the two sides. You can almost pick one, like flip a coin, and help them end the war finally and do it quickly, because it's the war that's causing the displacements, the war that's causing the violence against civilians, etc., etc. So, yeah, I agree. Prolonging the war is probably a bad idea, but helping one of the two sides to end the war might actually be a good idea, since a decisive victory by one side or the other would not lead to a war amongst the great powers, and there's zero chance that it could lead to a nuclear war. So what exactly is the risk? The only real possible exception is Ukraine, because there Russia has determined that subjugating Ukraine is in its vital natural interest. Still, I would say that the risk of escalation is to lead to a World War III or even a major war with NATO, limited to Europe, that could potentially involve nuclear weapons. I think that risk is actually very small, thanks in large measure, to nuclear weapons. Now, in the meantime, it should be clear to all that letting Russia getting away with its aggression out of fear of what is unlikely to happen would itself be contrary to the West's interests, possibly even vital ones, at least for Europeans. So basically, risk aversion and an emphasis on crisis management, born of the Cold War, has become an almost hegemonic paradigm with which Western countries, the United States chief among them, understand conflict and respond to conflict, even when the risk of escalation is nothing like it was during the Cold War. So perhaps it might be time to upend, or rather update, the paradigm. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and please also in the description check out links to my Substack, also called Pax Americana, as well as my Twitter and my LinkedIn feed and my own website, michaelshirkin.com. There's more stuff in the pipeline about foreign militaries and other areas of conflict, so please watch this space, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.